Racist and anti-Semitic messages were hung over highway overpasses, passed out on flyers, and graffitied on walls all across the state. And these were just some of hundreds of cases of white supremacist propaganda reported in Massachusetts last year, more than almost any other state apart from Virginia, Texas, California, and New York. That's according to a new report from the Anti-Defamation League released this week, which also found white supremacist propaganda at record levels nationwide. GBH News' senior investigative reporter Phillip Martin has been covering these alarming trends for years. He joins me now to discuss, along with Gregory Fried, a professor of political philosophy at Boston College, where he specializes in the intersection of race and philosophy and the rise of ethno-nationalism. Phillip, Gregory, thanks for joining us today.
Okay, thank you.
Pleasure. Phillip, tell us, how bad is what we're talking about?
Well, this is a record year. The Anti-Defamation League has puts out these reports every year on extremism. They've been doing this since 2017, and this is a record year with over 7,500 acts of white supremacist propaganda being distributed around the country. And Massachusetts, though the number of incidents, if you will, has decreased somewhat from last year, it's still very high, making Massachusetts the fifth largest state, I should say the fifth state in the United States that where you find white supremacist propaganda being heavily promulgated. And you at the beginning of this discussion, you talked about overpasses. We've seen a lot of that from the groups like the Patriot Front and NSC 131, a group called the Nationalist Social Club 131. And we've seen even propaganda being distributed by a prison gang called the Aryan Circle.
So when we look at the data, what we see is that from 2018 to 2023, we're seeing an increase in the United States of reported incidents from 1,214 all the way up to 7,546, which is incredible. In Massachusetts, it's actually worse. I mean, hard as that is to believe, from 11 incidents in 2017 all the way up to 339 in 2023. That's a 3,000% increase.
That's right.
So Gregory, do we have a sense as to what's causing this extraordinary surge?
I think some of it is political opportunism on the part of these groups that sense that they have a historical moment in which it's time to strike and make their mark. I think that it may be because Massachusetts and the greater Boston area is a center of education and they're hoping to recruit among the younger generation. And it may also be because they sense that there's some kind of political drift in the American Northeast away among white working class from the once proud and strong democratic alliance between various groups to disaffection with American political parties now.
So is this, I mean, it's easy to ascribe all things to Trump, but is this a Trump effect where he's just taking down the norms towards this sort of behavior in people, or is there more going on than that?
I don't think it's a coordinated effort.
No, I'm not suggesting that. Just suggesting
I think Trump has given permission to people to be receptive and to make such kind of propagandistic overtures. But honestly, I think the bigger problem is not these very fringe groups, but the importation of some of their ideas into mainstream discourse in right-wing media and by Donald Trump and those who follow them themselves. So it's one thing for the National Social Club or the Patriot Front to behave in this way. It's another thing for Tucker Carlson to adopt the great replacement theory, which is in its origins a fascist white supremacist theory of what is going on in Europe and the United States. And that we saw at the march in Charlottesville where they were chanting, "Jews will not replace us." That was a version of the great replacement theory. So to have that becoming mainstreamed in American political discourse, that's what's truly disturbing. And for me, these outlier groups are kind of the canary in the coal mine. and not directly what we should be most worried about, because they don't have a serious political presence of their own. It's really the MAGA movement that is what we should be concerned with as importing those ideas in a respectable form.
I think that's right. And I think a term that you use, opportunism, is absolutely appropriate, because, I mean, it's no coincidence that MAGA operatives, individuals, the movement itself has targeted trans and gay people, for example. And so what do you see? You see NSC 131, you see the Patriot Front, seeing that as an opportunity. And they go out and picket and distribute literature against gay and trans people, show up at events where gay and trans people are present. It's no coincidence, for example, also that they've latched onto the DEI issue, where DEI has essentially become, for the far right and for much of the MAGA movement and a lot of the Republican Party, it's become a surrogate issue for race. You replace the word DEI and you put in black person, or you put in Latino person, and you're basically making the same level of excoriation, the same type of excoriation, the same type of vilification of people based on their race. But you now have a ready excuse by talking about, by declaring that you're really talking about the process and the principles of DEI. And the far right have understood that this has become a mainstream issue and are using it in order to basically embed themselves further into the mainstream. So the Patriot Front, while they are seen, they are in fact a neo-Nazi group, formerly of Stormfront members, who basically changed their tactics and changed their appearance in order to win acceptability. The same thing is true with the language that they use. They use certain language in order to convey respectability. They rarely use explicit neo-Nazi language these days, except online and amongst themselves. And what they try to do is to speak in terms that what one would be, as Gregory pointed out, would be described as mainstream propaganda.
Yes, and I do think that the gold standard for them is to get some of those ideas imported into what we would think of as right-wing media and talk radio on Fox News by people like Tucker Carlson on the Great Replacement Theory. But you hear this creeping into Donald Trump's own language. And you mentioned gay and trans people, the DEI as a substitute for directly talking about race, but also the attacks on immigrants.
That's right.
All three of these are groups that are extremely vulnerable and politically weak, and these are easy targets. And in movements like this, neo-fascist movements, it's very important for them to have an enemy that they can target without worrying that they're going to have to pay a price for it.
That's right.
And I think what's really disturbing is some of the most recent language of Donald Trump, where he talks about the political opponents that his movement has as vermin, as Marxists, as fascists, and as if I can get the exact language, I'm going to have to paraphrase, but when he has said recently in his Patriots' Day speech that the internal enemies in the United States are a greater enemy to the United States than North Korea or Iran or what have you. This is a classic fascist move, and these kinds of tropes that we see in the extremist groups getting imported into mainstream right-wing propaganda is what allows a now very powerful political movement in the United States to mobilize those kinds of tropes.
Indeed.
So I think People who live in Massachusetts tend to think that Massachusetts is kind of immune to this sort of thing, or at least less susceptible than anywhere else in the country. What does it say that, in fact, the numbers seem to be higher here? I know when I saw those numbers, I was doing a per capita adjustment in my head, and that actually made Massachusetts look even worse.
Well, I think what they see in Massachusetts is an opportunity to contravene the assumptions about Massachusetts. Massachusetts, they correctly figure, has also a conservative aspects to the state, and you do have parties within the state who might be susceptible to these type of messages. And so the NSC 131 Patriot Front, they essentially are trying to, again, create a situation where that's in contravention to assumptions about what the state is, and to try to turn liberal democracy on its head. And so it's not entirely surprising that these groups, again, coming out of the Northeast, the Patriot Front is a Texas-based group. NSC 131 is indeed a Massachusetts-based group. They find that within the state that there's the possibility of turning someone around, and the fact is their ranks have grown. NSC 131, Patriot Front has experienced growth nationally, not necessarily in Massachusetts, but they know exactly what they're doing.
I think one other thing I would say about it is we can't neglect the internal politics to these movements. They're also competing with each other for prestige. And coming to the liberal Northeast as a place to engage in confrontation and conflict can be seen as a badge of honor among these competing groups. So I think there's some element of that in it as well, that this is a kind of act of aggression and daring on their part to be present here in the Northeast.
Well, Phillip, Gregory, this is something that we should all be concerned about, and we'll track it closely here, and I'm sure you will as well. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
My pleasure.